The old man sat alone in his tower, watching the sun set over the mountains. Below him, thousands of feet down sheer cliffs, the world of empires and armies seemed impossibly distant. He had been here for 35 years, and in all that time he had never once left this fortress. He had never needed to. From this peak, he ruled a kingdom that stretched across Persia and Syria. A kingdom that terrified sultans and caliphs. A kingdom built not on armies, but on fear itself. His name was Hasan-i Sabbah, and he was about to change the world. It was 1090, when Hasan first climbed the treacherous path to Alamut. The fortress sat on a needle of rock in the Alborz Mountains, so high that eagles nested below its walls. Local rulers had called it impenetrable for centuries. Hasan smiled at that word. He had learned long ago that no wall was high enough to stop an idea, and no fortress secure enough to resist a determined man who had nothing to lose. He had not come with an army. He had come alone, disguised as a teacher. For years, his followers had been infiltrating the garrison, converting soldiers one by one in secret nighttime meetings. When the commander finally realized what was happening, Hasan simply walked up to him and made an offer. 3,000 gold dinars for the fortress and safe passage out. The commander took the money and fled. Hasan never paid a single coin. He had bluffed, and the bluff had worked. That was the Hashashin way. Never fight fair. Never fight when you can outthink. Never strike when you can wait. Hasan-i Sabbah had not always been a mountain warlord. In his youth, he had been a scholar, studying theology in the great cities of Persia. He had met the famous Nizam al-Mulk, who would become the most powerful vizier in the Seljuk Empire. Legend said they studied together as boys. A fortune-teller had predicted that one would rule the empire, and the other would shake it to its foundations. The legend was probably false, but the truth it contained was undeniable. Nizam became the empire's master. Nizam became its nightmare. The Seljuk Turks ruled everything that mattered in the 11th century. Their armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their sultans commanded from the Mediterranean to the borders of China, and they were Sunni Muslims who viewed Hasan's Ismaili faith as heresy worthy of death. Ismailis were hunted, tortured, executed. Their communities were burned. Their scholars were crucified on city gates. Hasan had no army to fight back. He had no money to hire mercenaries. He had no allies among the powerful. What he had was a fortress, a handful of devoted followers, and a terrible idea. What if you could kill a king with a single dagger? What if you could train men to walk into the heart of enemy territory, past guards, and generals, and walls, and swords, and strike down the most powerful men in the world? What if you could make the mighty feel vulnerable for the first time in their lives? On October 16, 1092, Hasan put his idea to the test. His target was Nizam al-Mulk himself, the vizier, who had supposedly been his schoolmate, now the architect of Ismaili persecution. The vizier was traveling with the sultan's court, surrounded by thousands of soldiers. No army could reach him, no army tried. A young man approached the vizier's litter, who was dressed as a Sufi mystic, humble robes and a begging bowl. The guards barely glanced at him. Sufis were everywhere in those days, harmless holy men seeking alms. The young man stepped closer, closer still. Then he lunged forward and drove a dagger into Nizam al-Mulk's heart. The vizier died instantly. The assassin was cut down moments later, but the message traveled across the Islamic world. A single man, armed only with courage and a blade, had killed the second most powerful person in the empire. Hasan-i Sabbah watched from his mountain and smiled. 37 days later, the sultan himself died under mysterious circumstances. Some said the Hashashin poisoned him too. Hashashin never confirmed or denied it. Let them wonder. Let them fear. The Hashashin were not simply assassins. They were believers, followers of the Ismaili faith, who saw themselves as defenders of truth against oppression. Their name came from their enemies, who called them Hashashin as an insult. Hashish users, lowlifes, heretics. The word would eventually travel to Europe and become assassin, the name for a killer who strikes for political reasons. But to Hasan's followers, they were simply al-Dawa, al-Jadida, the new preaching. At Alamut, Hasan created a training system unlike anything the world had seen. Young men came to the fortress from across Persia and Syria, drawn by the promise of truth and the hope of justice. They studied for years. Theology first, because without faith the blade was meaningless. then languages, because an assassin must move unseen among enemies. Then philosophy and strategy, because the mind was the deadliest weapon of all. Only after years of preparation did they learn the art of the dagger, the craft of approaching a target, the moment of perfect stillness before the strike. But the training was only part of the story. The Hashashin's real weapon was psychological. When a governor persecuted Ismailis in his city, he might wake one morning to find a dagger stuck in the ground beside his bed with a note that read, "Leave our people alone, or next time this dagger will be in your heart." He would triple his guards. He would sleep in different rooms. He would trust no one. Still, he would never feel safe. This was the genius of Hasan-i Sabbah. He couldn't defeat empires in battle, so he made the men who ran those empires afraid to act. Fear paralyzed them. Fear made them negotiate. Fear gave the Hashashin space to survive and grow. By the time Hasan died in 1124 at the age of 80, he had built a state that would last for 166 years. He had never left Alamut in all that time, but his reach extended across the Islamic world. He had transformed a handful of desperate believers into a power that sultans and caliphs could not ignore. On his deathbed, he called his successors and gave them his final instructions. "Nothing is true," he told them. "Everything is permitted." Scholars would debate the meaning of those words for centuries. Some saw them as a statement of philosophy, a recognition that all power was temporary and all truth contested. Others saw them as a practical instruction, a reminder that in the struggle for survival, no tactic was forbidden. Whatever the meaning, the message was clear. The work would continue, and it did. 3 more generations, the Hashashin would strike fear into the hearts of the mighty. They would face crusaders and caliphs, sultans and shahs. They would expand into Syria, building fortresses in the mountains that still stand today. They would become legend. But legends have a way of attracting enemies. And in the east, a new power was rising. A power that would make the Seljuks look like children playing at war. The Mongols were coming. And they had no fear of daggers. The year was 1256, and the world was ending. For the people of Persia, the Mongol invasion was not just a war. It was an apocalypse. The armies of Genghis Khan had swept through Central Asia decades earlier, destroying cities, massacring populations, leaving pyramids of skulls to mark their passage. Now his grandson, Hulagu, had returned with orders to finish what his grandfather started. The target this time was the Islamic heartland, Baghdad, Damascus, and the mountain fortresses of the Hashashin. Hulagu's army was unlike anything the Hashashin had ever faced. Today, it numbered perhaps 150,000 soldiers, including contingents from conquered peoples across Asia. They had Chinese engineers who built siege weapons, capable of smashing the thickest walls. They had Mongol cavalry who could ride for days without rest, living on blood and mare's milk. They had no fear of death because their shamans promised them paradise if they fell in battle. Against this force, the Hashashin could field perhaps 10,000 fighters at most, scattered across dozens of mountain fortresses. Their strategy of assassination was useless against an enemy with no single leader to target. Their psychological warfare meant nothing to men who had grown up in the steppes, where weakness meant death and fear was a luxury. The Hashashin leader at this time was Imam Rushena Gersha, a young man who had inherited a crisis not of his making. His predecessors had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated the Mongols. When Hulagu demanded submission, they had sent evasive answers and tried to play for time. They had assassinated Mongol generals who ventured too close to their territory. They had provoked a response that would destroy them. In 1256, Hulagu marched on Alamut. The campaign was methodical. The Mongols didn't try to storm the main fortress immediately. Instead, they captured the smaller forts one by one, starving them into submission, or smashing them with siege engines. Each fortress that fell meant fewer defenders for Alamut. Each victory brought the Mongols closer to the eagle's nest. Inside Alamut, Korsha faced an impossible choice. He could fight and die as his grandfathers would have done. He could surrender and hope for mercy, though the Mongols were not known for mercy. He could try to negotiate, though Hulagu had shown little interest in negotiation. He chose to negotiate. In November 1256, Korsha descended from Alamut and surrendered to Hulagu personally. He ordered the remaining Hashashin fortresses to submit. Most obeyed. A few held out, but without central leadership, they could not last. Kulago accepted the surrender, but he had no intention of honoring it. The Hashashin were too dangerous to leave alive. Their fortresses were too strong to leave standing. As soon as Korshaw's followers had laid down their arms, the Mongols began the systematic destruction of everything the Hashashin had built. Alamut was dismantled stone by stone. Its famous library, which had contained priceless manuscripts on philosophy, science, and theology, was burned. Its defenders were executed. Its treasures were looted. The Eagle's Nest, which had stood for 166 years, was reduced to rubble. Korshaw himself was sent to the Great Khan in Mongolia, supposedly to pay homage. On the journey, he was murdered. The Mongols later claimed he had tried to escape. No one believed them. But not all the Hashashin died at Alamut. Some fortresses held out for years. Girdku, a mighty stronghold in northern Persia, resisted until 1270, falling only after a siege of more than a decade. The Syrian branch survived even longer, protected by the Mamluk sultans of Egypt, who saw them as useful allies against the Crusaders. The Mamluks, however, had their own reasons for eliminating the Hashashin. In 1273, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, the same warrior who had defeated the Mongols at Angelut, turned on the Syrian Hashashin. He besieged their fortresses one by one, offering generous terms for surrender. Most accepted. The ones who didn't were destroyed. By 1275, the Hashashin, as an independent power, had ceased to exist. Their fortresses were occupied by foreign garrisons. Their leaders were dead or in hiding, their followers scattered across the Middle East, blending into the population, waiting for better days. But the Hashashin did not die completely. The Nazari-Ismaili faith survived, carried by descendants of the original believers who had escaped the Mongol and Mamluk massacres. They went underground, practicing their religion in secret, passing their traditions from generation to generation. Today, the Nazari-Ismailis are a thriving community, led by the Aga Khan, who claims descent from the same line of imams that Hasan-i Sabbah followed. They number in the millions, living in dozens of countries around the world. They are doctors and lawyers and business people, not assassins. The name Hashashin survived too, though transformed. It traveled to Europe with crusaders and merchants, becoming assassin, a word for a killer who strikes for political reasons. In Arabic and Persian, it remained an insult, a reminder of the sect that had terrified the mighty, and the legend survived. The Hashashin became figures of mystery and romance, their story told and retold in countless books and films. They were portrayed as drug-crazed fanatics, as enlightened philosophers, as freedom fighters, as terrorists. Marco Polo's tale of the Secret Garden, though almost certainly fictional, became the standard account for centuries. Modern historians have stripped away the myths, revealing a complex reality that is both more mundane and more fascinating than the legends. The truth is that the Hashashin were not superhuman. They were not drug-addled zombies. They were not invincible. They were simply people who believed deeply in a cause and found a way to fight for it against impossible odds. Their methods were brutal, but no more brutal than the methods of their enemies. Their faith was sincere, even if their enemies called it heresy. Their legacy is complicated, as all human legacies are. The Eagle's Nest is empty now. The mountain, where Hasan-i Sabbah sat for 35 years, watching the sun set over his kingdom, is silent. The walls of Alamut are broken, scattered across the slope where they fell 8 centuries ago. The Fedayeen are dust. The sultans and caliphs they terrified are dust too. But the story remains. A story of faith and courage, of desperation and cunning. Of a handful of believers who shook the world and then vanished into the sands of time.